Aaliyah Carter was never the woman who held me back. She was the woman who refused to keep pretending she belonged behind me. Richard Whitmore smiled as he said it, and the room filled with polite laughter. But everyone who heard those words understood the truth hidden underneath them. He was not honoring his ex-wife. He was reminding everyone that he believed he had outgrown her. The ballroom of the Whitmore Foundation Gala glittered with crystal lights, expensive suits, and conversations between people who measured success by the size of a company and the number of names on a guest list. Richard stood at the center of it all, surrounded by investors, executives, and the kind of people who had the power to open doors with a single phone call. At 39 years old, he had built exactly the image he always wanted. Confident, untouchable, successful, a man who had climbed higher than anyone expected. A reporter holding a microphone near the stage tilted her head and asked, "Richard, many people followed your divorce from Aaliyah Carter. Looking back now, do you think ending that marriage changed your life?" Richard took a slow breath, the way people did when they wanted their next sentence to sound thoughtful. "I think some people are meant to walk beside you for a season," he answered. "And some people simply cannot follow where you are going." The crowd nodded. They liked answers that sounded wise. They liked stories where successful people had to make difficult choices. But what they did not know was that behind Richard's polished words was a woman who had spent years quietly rebuilding herself after being told she was not enough. Across town, Aaliyah Carter sat behind the front desk of the Franklin Community Library, organizing returned books while rain tapped softly against the windows. Her life looked completely different from Richard's. No cameras, no business meetings, no expensive dresses. Just a warm cup of coffee, a stack of paperwork, and a quiet place where people still remembered her name. "You staying late again?" Marcus Bell asked as he walked by with a box of donated books. Aaliyah smiled. "Only another hour." Marcus looked at her carefully. "You know you don't have to keep proving you can handle everything, right?" For a moment, her smile faded. Because deep down, that was the hardest part. After the divorce, everyone assumed she had lost. Richard kept the house. He kept the connections. He kept telling people he had made the right decision. And Aaliyah let him believe it. Not because she was weak. Because she was tired of fighting for a place in someone's life where she was no longer respected. She had learned that sometimes silence was not surrender. Sometimes silence was the beginning of a new chapter. That evening, as Aaliyah locked the library doors, her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. "Hello," she answered. A calm woman's voice replied. "Miss Carter, my name is Victoria Hayes. I represent your father's estate." Aaliyah froze. She had not heard that name connected to her life in years. "My father's estate," she repeated quietly. Victoria paused before answering. "Yes, there is something you need to know. The final documents have been located." Aaliyah looked out at the empty street, unaware that the life Richard thought he had left behind was about to return in a way nobody could predict. Because the woman he once called ordinary was about to discover a truth that had been waiting for her all along. The morning after Aaliyah Carter received the unexpected phone call, she sat at her small kitchen table, staring at a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. She had spent the entire night thinking about one question. Why now? For years, she had lived a quiet life without asking for anything from her past. She had accepted that some doors were meant to stay closed. But hearing the words, "your father's estate," brought back memories she had carefully packed away. Not painful memories, just complicated ones. Memories of a family name she never wanted to use as an advantage. Aaliyah had never been interested in living behind a famous last name or showing people what she might have had. She wanted to be valued for who she was, not for what was written on a piece of paper. Later that morning, she arrived at a small law office in downtown Seattle. It was nothing like Richard's world of glass towers and private meetings. The building was older, with wooden floors and shelves filled with decades of legal records. At the front desk stood a woman in her early 60s with silver hair and a calm expression. "Aaliyah Carter?" the woman asked. Aaliyah nodded. "Yes." The woman smiled gently. "I am Victoria Hayes. I have been waiting a long time to meet you." Aaliyah looked confused. "I am sorry, but I do not understand. Why would you be waiting for me?" Victoria motioned toward a quiet office. "Because your father left very specific instructions. He wanted these documents delivered only when you were ready to receive them." Inside the office sat an old wooden box on the table. It looked simple, almost ordinary. Aaliyah stared at it. "That is it?" she asked. Victoria nodded. "That is everything your father wanted you to have." Aaliyah slowly opened the box. Inside were old photographs, handwritten letters, and a sealed folder. She picked up one of the letters first. The handwriting was familiar. Her father's handwriting. She had not seen it in years. He never talked about this part of his life, Aaliyah whispered. Victoria sat across from her. Your father made mistakes. But one thing he never questioned was your ability to lead. Aaliyah looked up. Lead what? Victoria placed her hand on the folder. Before you read this, you need to understand something. This is not about money. It is not about proving anyone wrong. It is about responsibility. Those words stayed with Aaliyah. Because for the first time in years, someone was not looking at her like a failure. Someone was looking at her like she mattered. Meanwhile, across the city, Richard Whitmore was having a very different morning. He sat in his corner office overlooking downtown, reviewing contracts for his company's next major expansion. When his assistant mentioned Aaliyah's name, he barely looked up. Aaliyah, he asked with a small laugh. Why are we talking about her? His assistant hesitated. There are rumors she was contacted by a lawyer connected to her family. Richard leaned back in his chair. Her family? He smiled. Whatever it is, it cannot be that serious. He had spent years believing he understood Aaliyah completely. To him, she was kind, but ordinary. Supportive, but not ambitious. Someone who belonged in his past, not in his future. What Richard did not know was that the woman he had already written off was sitting across town with a folder that could change everything he thought he knew. Victoria finally looked at Aaliyah and said, There is one document you need to see before anything else. She placed the folder in front of her. This is the beginning of the truth. Richard Whitmore had built his entire life around one belief. If you wanted to know someone's value, you looked at what they owned, who respected them, and how much power they could hold in a room. That belief had made him successful. It had also made him blind. The next morning, Richard walked into the Whitmore Group headquarters with the same confidence he carried every day. The lobby was filled with employees greeting him, investors waiting for meetings, and assistants rushing to keep up with his schedule. To everyone around him, he looked like a man who had everything under control. He entered his office and placed his coffee on the desk while his assistant, Lauren, followed behind with a tablet in her hands. Richard, there is something you should know, she said carefully. He looked up. About what? It is regarding Aaliyah Carter. Richard sighed slightly, almost amused. What now? Lauren hesitated. She met with Victoria Hayes yesterday. For a moment, Richard said nothing. Then he leaned back in his chair and smiled. Victoria Hayes? The estate attorney. Lauren nodded. Richard gave a quiet laugh. That is impossible. Aaliyah has never been interested in that world. He looked out at the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows. She always wanted a simple life. What he did not realize was that Aaliyah's simple life had never meant a small life. It had only meant a life she chose. Across town, Aaliyah sat in Victoria's office, reading through the first pages of the documents her father left behind. The information was overwhelming. Names of companies, investment records, family holdings, agreements that stretched back decades. She looked up slowly. I do not understand. Why did he keep this from me? Victoria folded her hands. Because your father knew money could change how people saw you. He wanted you to discover who you were before you discovered what you owned. Aaliyah looked back at the papers. And what exactly am I supposed to do with this? Victoria answered honestly. That decision has always been yours. Those words meant more than Aaliyah expected. For years, Richard had made decisions for both of them. He decided what mattered. He decided what success looked like. He decided when her dreams were too small and when her opinions were inconvenient. But sitting there, holding documents that represented a part of herself she never knew existed, Aaliyah felt something she had not felt in a long time. Control. Not over Richard. Not over anyone else. Over her own life. Later that afternoon, Richard attended a private business lunch with his closest partners. The conversation was supposed to be about expansion plans and future investments. Instead, one of the executives mentioned a name that caught his attention. The Carter Legacy Fund has been reviewing several business portfolios recently. Richard stopped cutting his food. The Carter Legacy Fund. The executive nodded. Yes, they have significant influence in several industries. Richard forced a smile. Interesting. I was not aware of any connection. But inside, something felt different. Because for the first time, he wondered if there was a part of Aaliyah's life he had never understood. That evening, Richard searched her name online. He expected to find nothing important. Instead, He found references to old family records, charitable foundations, and business connections he had never seen before. His expression slowly changed. The woman he had spent years describing as ordinary suddenly became a question he could not answer. Meanwhile, Aaliyah stood in front of her apartment window, holding the final document Victoria had given her. She had not opened it yet. She was afraid of what it might reveal. Victoria's words echoed in her mind. The final page is the one your father believed you needed to read last. Aaliyah placed her hand on the folder. She knew something was waiting inside. Something that would change not only how the world saw her, but how she saw herself. Aaliyah Carter had spent years believing that the hardest part of losing Richard was losing the marriage. She was wrong. The hardest part was realizing how easily someone she loved had convinced her that she was less than she truly was. That night, sitting alone in her apartment, she finally opened the last envelope Victoria Hayes had given her. Her hands were steady, but her heart was not. Inside was a single letter from her father, along with a document that carried a signature she recognized immediately. "My dearest Aaliyah," the letter began. She stopped for a moment. She had not heard his voice in years, but somehow those words felt like he was sitting across from her. "I know you may wonder why I waited so long. I did not want you to inherit a name. I wanted you to build one." Aaliyah swallowed hard as she continued reading. Her father explained that the family fortune was never meant to be a symbol of status. It was meant to be a responsibility. But there was one condition attached to the inheritance. Before she could take full control, she had to prove that she could lead with compassion, not pride. Aaliyah smiled sadly. Even after all those years, her father still knew her. He knew she was never interested in power for attention. She wanted purpose. The next morning, Aaliyah met Victoria again. This time, she had more questions than answers. "Why did nobody tell me about any of this before?" Aaliyah asked. Victoria looked at her carefully. "Because your father knew what kind of person you were. He knew if you learned about the money too soon, people would treat you differently." Aaliyah looked down at the documents. Richard did that without knowing anything about this. Victoria nodded quietly. "That is exactly why this matters." Meanwhile, Richard Whitmore was beginning to feel the pressure he never expected. After seeing the information connected to Aaliyah's family, he contacted one of his advisors. "Find out what is happening," he ordered. "I want to know why everyone suddenly cares about Carter." The advisor looked through the records and hesitated. "Richard, this may be bigger than we thought." Richard frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means Aaliyah Carter was never just your former wife." The words bothered him more than he wanted to admit. For years, Richard had told himself the divorce was proof that he made the right decision. He told people Aaliyah was kind but lacked ambition. He told himself he needed someone who matched his world. But now, for the first time, he wondered if he had confused quiet strength with weakness. 2 days later, Richard attended a charity event where several major investors were gathered. He arrived with Claire Whitmore beside him, confident that the evening would remind everyone of his success. During the event, a conversation changed the atmosphere. One investor mentioned the Carter Legacy Fund. "They are preparing for a leadership transition," the investor said. Richard tried to stay calm. "Interesting. Who is taking over?" Before anyone could answer, the doors at the entrance opened. Aaliyah walked in. She was not wearing anything flashy. She was not trying to prove anything. She simply walked with confidence, surrounded by people who respected her. Richard stared across the room. For the first time in years, he did not see the woman he left behind. He saw someone he never truly knew. Then Victoria stepped forward with a folder in her hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "before tonight continues, there is an announcement that must be made." The room became silent. Richard felt his confidence disappear. Because deep down, he already knew. The woman he once underestimated was about to reveal a truth that would change everything. The room was silent. Not the kind of silence that felt peaceful, but the kind that came when everyone realized something important was about to happen. Richard Whitmore stood near the center of the charity event, watching Aaliyah Carter walk toward the stage with a calm expression he could not understand. For years, he had been certain he knew exactly who she was. The quiet woman who supported him. The wife who stayed behind while he chased bigger goals. The person he believed would never stand in a room like this and command everyone's attention. But now, every person around him was looking at her differently. Victoria Hayes opened the folder in her hands. "Before we continue tonight's event, there is something that needs to be clarified," she said. Richard's expression tightened. He glanced at Claire, who looked just as confused. Victoria continued. Aaliyah Carter is the legal successor of the Carter Legacy Fund and the appointed representative of the Carter family estate. A quiet wave moved through the room. Investors exchanged looks. Guests whispered among themselves. Richard stood completely still. He waited for someone to explain that there had been a mistake, that this was some misunderstanding. But no one did. Aaliyah simply stood there, composed and steady. She did not look at Richard with anger. She did not look at him with revenge in her eyes. That somehow bothered him more than if she had. After the announcement, Richard found her near the private balcony overlooking the city. "Aaliyah," he said. She turned around. "Richard." He studied her face, searching for the person he remembered. "Why did you never tell me?" Aaliyah looked at him for a moment. "Tell you what? About this. About your family. About everything." She took a slow breath. "Because when we were married, I wanted you to love me for me." Her words landed harder than he expected. Richard looked away. "You could have trusted me." Aaliyah gave a small, sad smile. "I did trust you. That was the problem." For a moment, Richard had no answer. Because he remembered the years when Aaliyah had stood beside him before the money, before the recognition, before people knew his name. She had supported his dreams when nobody else did. She had celebrated his small victories. She had believed in him. And somewhere along the way, he started seeing her support as something he was entitled to, not something he should appreciate. Across the room, Claire approached Richard after Aaliyah walked away. "Are you telling me your ex-wife controls all of that?" she asked quietly. Richard did not answer. Claire looked concerned. "Richard, this changes everything." Those words bothered him because they revealed something he had never admitted. Many people around him respected his success, but some of them only cared about what came with it. Meanwhile, Aaliyah spent the rest of the evening meeting employees, investors, and community leaders connected to the Carter Foundation. She listened more than she spoke. She asked questions. She took notes. She did not act like someone who had just discovered power. She acted like someone who had always understood responsibility. The next morning, Richard received a message from his legal team. The Carter Legacy Fund had requested a review of several business agreements connected to Whitmore Group. His confidence faded as he read the details. This was not about embarrassing him. This was about accountability. For the first time, Richard realized Aaliyah was not trying to destroy the life he built. She was simply making sure the truth was no longer hidden. But what Richard did not know was that the review would uncover something much bigger than a business disagreement. Something connected to decisions he had made after their divorce. And when that truth came out, he would have to face the one thing he had avoided for years: the consequences of underestimating the person who knew him best. Richard Whitmore had spent years believing that losing control was impossible. He built his reputation on confidence, careful decisions, and always being the person with the answers. But now, sitting alone in his office, staring at the review notice from the Carter Legacy Fund, he felt something he had not experienced in a long time: uncertainty. He read through the documents again, hoping to find a simple explanation. A misunderstanding. A technical issue. Anything that would prove this was not connected to him. But the more he read, the clearer it became. The review was not random. Someone had looked closely at the decisions made after his divorce from Aaliyah Carter. "This cannot be happening," Richard whispered. His assistant, Lauren, stood near the door with a concerned expression. "Richard, there is something else you should see." She placed another folder on his desk. "This came from the legal team this morning." Richard opened it slowly. Inside were old financial records from the months after the divorce. His eyes moved across the pages, and his expression changed. The documents showed several business decisions that had been made when he believed Aaliyah had no influence anymore. Decisions he had made without considering that she might one day have a voice in the company. Across the city, Aaliyah sat in a meeting with the Carter Foundation team. She listened as executives discussed projects, investments, and future plans. But unlike Richard's meetings, nobody was trying to impress her. They were trying to solve problems. "What do people actually need from us?" Aaliyah asked. One of the directors looked surprised. "Most leaders ask about numbers first." Aaliyah smiled slightly. "Numbers matter, but they are connected to people." That answer reminded everyone why her father had chosen her. Not because she knew everything, because she cared enough to learn. Later that afternoon, Victoria Hayes visited Aaliyah privately. She placed a small envelope on the table. "There is something else your father wanted you to have." Aaliyah looked at the envelope carefully. "Another letter?" Victoria nodded. Yes, but this one is different. Aaliyah opened it and began reading. Her father wrote about Richard, about how he had met him years earlier, about how impressed he was by Richard's ambition. But there was a warning too. Never build your life around someone who only values you when you are useful. Aaliyah stopped reading. The words hit differently now, because they explained something she had spent years trying to understand. Richard did not stop loving her because she changed. He stopped appreciating her because he started believing he was above her. Meanwhile, Richard was facing pressure from people who once praised him. Investors were asking questions. Partners wanted explanations. The same people who celebrated his success were now wondering if they had trusted the wrong person. Then Claire walked into his office. She looked nervous. Richard, we need to talk. He looked up. About what? She hesitated. About what happens if this affects the company. Richard stared at her. Are you worried about me or the company? Claire looked away. That small moment told him everything. For years, Richard thought he had replaced Aaliyah with a life that was better. But now, when things became difficult, he realized something painful. The people who surrounded him during his success were not always the people who cared about him. That evening, Richard made a decision. He would meet with Aaliyah, not as her former husband, not as the man who thought he had won, but as someone who finally needed answers. When he arrived at the Carter Foundation office, he expected anger. He expected accusations. Instead, Aaliyah simply looked at him and said, I wondered how long it would take before you came here. Richard lowered his eyes. Aaliyah, I need to understand something. She waited. Did you know all along who you were? Aaliyah looked at him quietly. The question you should be asking is why you needed me to have money before you believed I had value. Richard had no response. Because for the first time, he realized the biggest mistake he made was not losing a powerful woman. It was failing to recognize her when she was standing right beside him. But before he could answer, Victoria entered the room holding another file. Aaliyah, she said softly. We found something else in the records. She placed the file on the table. Something Richard needs to see. Richard Whitmore stared at the file sitting on the table between him and Aaliyah Carter, but for the first time in his life, he did not want to open it. Because deep down, he already knew that whatever was inside would not just affect his company. It would force him to face the choices he had spent years avoiding. Victoria Hayes remained standing near the doorway, holding the folder firmly in her hands. This information was found during the estate review, she explained. It was not something your father included in the original announcement because he wanted the truth to come out at the right time. Richard looked at Aaliyah. What does this have to do with me? Victoria placed the folder on the table. It concerns several decisions made by Whitmore Group after your divorce. Richard opened the file. The first few pages showed business transactions, investment movements, and approvals made during the months after he and Aaliyah separated. At first, he looked confident. He had seen thousands of documents throughout his career. Numbers did not scare him. But then he noticed something. His name, his signature, his decisions. And beside them, notes from a legal review. Aaliyah watched his expression change. She did not feel satisfaction. She felt disappointment. Because she remembered the man Richard used to be. The man who stayed late working on business plans at their kitchen table. The man who once told her that success meant nothing if you had nobody to share it with. You knew about this? Richard asked. Aaliyah shook her head. No. Then why does it feel like everyone knew except me? Her voice stayed calm. Because you stopped listening to anyone who did not agree with you. The words hit harder than he expected. The review revealed that Richard had made several strategic choices based on assumptions about the company's future. He had ignored smaller partners, dismissed concerns from advisors, and rushed decisions because he wanted to prove he was still in complete control. But now those choices were being questioned. Not because Aaliyah wanted revenge, because the truth had finally caught up. The next morning, Richard walked into a board meeting expecting to defend himself. Instead, he found a room full of people asking difficult questions. Richard, why were these decisions made without additional review? One board member asked. He looked around the table. These were the same people who once praised him. The same people who called him a visionary. But now they wanted answers. For the first time, Richard understood something important. Respect built only on success disappears the moment success becomes uncertain. Meanwhile, Aaliyah continued working with the Carter Foundation. She received messages from people who wanted her to publicly attack Richard. They wanted a dramatic response. They wanted headlines. But she refused. Marcus Bell asked her, Are you sure you do not want the world to know what he did? Aaliyah looked out the office window. The truth does not need me to become cruel. That answer surprised even Marcus. Because the woman Richard underestimated was not trying to become powerful. She was proving she already was. Later that evening, Richard received another unexpected visit. Claire stood outside his office, holding a small box of personal items. I think we need some space, she said quietly. Richard looked at her. You are leaving? Claire avoided his eyes. I just do not know what happens next. For years, Richard believed people stayed because of who he was. Now he was learning some people stayed because of what he represented. After she left, Richard sat alone in the dark office. His phone buzzed with another message from Victoria. A new discovery had been made in the estate records. A document connected to the final condition of Aaliyah's inheritance. Richard opened the message and froze. The document was not about money. It was about the one thing he had never considered. Aaliyah had the power to decide his future, and the next choice she made would determine whether he lost everything or finally faced the person he had become. Richard Whitmore had spent the last few days waiting for Aaliyah Carter to destroy him. He expected anger. He expected a public statement. He expected her to use every piece of information she had against him. But what happened next was something he never saw coming. Victoria Hayes placed the final document from the estate in front of Aaliyah. Richard watched carefully, trying to understand why everyone seemed so serious. What is this? He asked. Victoria looked at him. This is the final condition your former wife's father placed on the inheritance. Richard looked at Aaliyah. And what does that mean? Aaliyah opened the document and read silently. Her expression changed, but not with excitement. It was something deeper, something closer to understanding. Her father's final instruction was simple. Before Aaliyah could fully control the Carter Legacy Fund, she had to make a decision involving the person who had once caused her the greatest disappointment. Richard's name was written clearly. Richard stood up. You have got to be kidding me. Victoria remained calm. Your father believed power reveals character. He wanted to know what kind of leader you would become when you finally had the ability to choose. Richard stared at Aaliyah. So this is what this was all along. You get to decide what happens to me. Aaliyah shook her head. No, Richard. That is what you still do not understand. She closed the document. This is not about controlling you. It is about whether I let my past control me. Those words stayed in the room. Because Richard finally saw something he had missed for years. Aaliyah was not standing there because she wanted revenge. She was standing there because she had finally stopped needing his approval. The next day, the board of Whitmore Group held an emergency meeting. Everyone expected Aaliyah to remove Richard from the company completely. The rumors had already spread. Some believed she would make him lose everything. Some believed she would do exactly what he once did to her. But when Aaliyah entered the room, she carried no anger. She carried a decision. I reviewed everything, she said. The mistakes, the financial risks, the choices that affected employees and partners. Richard watched silently. And what is your decision? One board member asked. Aaliyah looked around the room. Richard Whitmore will remain involved in the company under one condition. Everyone waited. He will no longer have unchecked control. The company will be restructured with accountability and transparency. Richard looked surprised. He had prepared himself for punishment. He had not prepared himself for fairness. Later that afternoon, Richard found Aaliyah outside the building. Why? He asked. She turned around. Why did you not destroy me? Aaliyah thought for a moment. Because becoming someone who only knows how to hurt others would mean you still control my life. Richard looked down. For once, he had nothing clever to say. No excuse. No explanation. Just the uncomfortable truth. That evening, Aaliyah returned home and opened the old letter from her father again. She read the final lines she had not noticed before. The greatest proof of strength is not having the power to take everything away. It is having the power to do so and choosing wisdom instead. Aaliyah smiled softly. She finally understood why her father had waited. He was not testing whether she could handle wealth. He was testing whether she could protect her heart. But just as she thought the chapter with Richard was closing, Victoria called with unexpected news. Aaliyah, there is something you need to know, she said. During the final review, we found another document. Aaliyah sat up. Another document? Victoria paused. Yes, and this one changes the story completely. Victoria Hayes's voice was quieter than usual when she called Aaliyah Carter that evening. That alone told Aaliyah something important. Victoria was never dramatic. She was the kind of person who chose every word carefully, especially when those words could change someone's life. Aaliyah, Victoria said, the additional document we found was not part of your father's inheritance plan. Aaliyah sat down slowly. Then what is it? There was a short pause. It is a letter your father wrote after your divorce from Richard. For a moment, Aaliyah could not speak. She thought she had already discovered every hidden part of her father's story. She thought the old wounds connected to Richard had finally been understood. But now, there was one more piece waiting. The next morning, Aaliyah met Victoria at the Carter Foundation office. The letter was placed carefully on the table. Aaliyah opened it and began reading. Her father wrote about the day he learned about her divorce. He wrote that he wanted to step in. He wanted to reveal everything. He wanted to remind Richard who Aaliyah really was. But he chose not to. Because he believed Aaliyah deserved something more valuable than protection. She deserved the chance to discover her own strength. The letter said, a person who only finds confidence after gaining power never truly owned their confidence. Real strength comes from knowing your worth before the world agrees. Aaliyah paused. Tears filled her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of finally understanding. For years, she believed Richard's rejection had taken something from her. But now she realized it had forced her to find something she had forgotten. Herself. Later that week, Richard requested one final meeting. Not in a boardroom. Not in front of investors. Just two people sitting across from each other. When Aaliyah arrived, Richard looked different. Not weaker, just more honest. I have spent a lot of time thinking about everything, he said. Aaliyah listened quietly. Richard looked down at his hands. I used to think I left because you were not enough for the life I wanted. He took a breath. But the truth is, I was afraid you would see that I was not the person I pretended to be. Aaliyah did not interrupt. You were there before the success, Richard continued. Before anyone cared about my name. You believed in me when I had nothing. Aaliyah looked at him. And I believed you loved me for who I was. Richard nodded slowly. I did. I just forgot how to value something that was real. The apology mattered. But Aaliyah knew forgiveness did not mean returning to the past. Some doors could close peacefully without needing to be reopened. Months later, the Carter Foundation announced a new community program focused on helping people rebuild after major life changes. It was Aaliyah's first major project as the leader of the foundation. She created opportunities for people who felt overlooked, because she understood what it felt like to be invisible. At the opening ceremony, Marcus stood beside her and smiled. Your father would be proud. Aaliyah looked around at the people gathered there. I hope so, but I think he would be happier knowing I became myself. Across the city, Richard watched the announcement on his phone. For the first time, he did not feel anger or jealousy. He felt respect. He finally understood the lesson Aaliyah had learned long before him. A person's value is not created by money, status, or someone else's approval. It exists long before anyone recognizes it. And the woman he once underestimated did not become powerful because she inherited a fortune. She became powerful because she never lost the one thing no one could take from her. Her sense of who she was.